This is Eitan Katz singing a new nigun that he just released called Kikel Melech that was composed in honor of Moti Kest, our dear friend that I've told you about who passed away in December. Let's just listen a little more. It's a nice one, huh? Beautiful job, Eitan. Thank you for composing that. New Nigun Ki Kel Melech. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to do the whole daf, the whole page here on a Sunday night? Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indiana, James in Indianapolis, Steve in New Hampshire, Yehuda in Florence, South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Patrice in Utah, Hannah in New York, Tom in snowy PA, Thomas in West Virginia, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Fred in Miami Beach, Lucy in Minnesota, Janice in Dallas, Fred missed this. Paula in Chicago, Miriam in Colorado, Tom loves the music. Fred, congrats to San Francisco. Yeah, we had the Cowboys picked in our pool, but okay, congratulations. Bill in mid-Missouri. Isabel says, Shalom, Guy. Ohio is with us. Tom, shalom to everyone. Heartbroken about yesterday's outrage, but thank God we had the proper result. The bad guy was liquidated and all the good guys were safe. Thank God. Thank God, thank God, thank God. Thank you, God, that everybody was safe in that hostage situation yesterday. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by my old friend Steve Potter. We were close in college. I haven't seen him since then, but somehow he found the show and he's been watching us. And he sponsored tonight's episode in honor of Sal and Nina. Steve, I really look forward to getting together with you one of these days and talking about God and faith and life and everything. Steve and I were on the rowing team together. We shared a lot of days out on the Charles River. Thank you, Steve, and may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. All right, where are we holding? This is Daf Daled, page 4 here in Tractate Moed Katan. This is the 12th volume of the Talmud. The laws of the intermediate days of the festivals. Chol, which means ordinary, mundane. Moed, which means the festivals. So this combination, the ordinary festival days, the in-between days, in between the festival days at the beginning and end of Passover and Sukkot. We pick this up at the bottom of 3b. The Gemara raises another question. Are these prohibitions of plowing before the sabbatical year really halachas, laws transmitted to Moses from Sinai? So we were talking about yesterday this idea that as kind of a fence around the Torah during a sabbatical year, the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, particularly when the temple is standing in the land of Israel. So every 6th year, there's going to be a superabundance. So in the 7th year, we just let the land rest, no farming whatsoever. But does that extension actually go beyond the 7th year, both before it and after it? that you can't do any plowing during the 6th year, which would benefit the land in the 7th year, nor any reaping in the 8th year, which would be harvesting vegetables or crops, produce that actually grew during the 7th year. And we see that the sages are having a debate. Well, is that restriction that the prohibition of plowing actually starts before the 7th year? Was that derived by the sages as a rabbinic decree, or was it actually, or could it be derived from the written Torah, or was it a halacha given orally to Moses at Mount Sinai? That's a discussion. And why are we even talking about the sabbatical year? Because some of these restrictions on work, remember the basic principle, you can do some work during the intermediate days of festivals, as long as it's to prevent a loss rather than to enhance a profit, and even to prevent a loss only if it doesn't involve excessive labor. In terms of preventing a loss, that has implications also in the sabbatical year, although the excessive labor codicil, as it were, does not apply in the sabbatical year. Okay, so that's how we got to here. So are these prohibitions of plowing before the sabbatical year actually halachas, laws transmitted to Moses at Sinai? Well, no, they are actually prohibitions based on explicit verses. We could derive it from the written Torah that you have to stop plowing even before the 7th year begins. As we learned in a baraisa with regard to the verse, in plowing and in reaping, you shall rest. That's Exodus 34:21. And Rabbi Akiva says it is unnecessary for the verse to speak about plowing and reaping during the sabbatical year, as it was already stated at Leviticus 25:4, but in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Your field you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. And this teaches that during the 7th year, all agricultural labor is prohibited. So the verse which says no plowing and reaping, a separate verse, it must come to prohibit something else. What? It comes to prohibit plowing on the eve of the sabbatical year, right? If we have a 7-year sabbatical cycle, well, the 6th year is like Erev Shabbos. It's like Friday afternoon. And on the eve of the sabbatical year, we already have to stop that work early, not by rabbinic decree, not by an oral teaching given to Moses at Sinai, but actually derivable from the written verse itself, says Rabbi Akiva. But prohibit plowing on the eve of the sabbatical year that entered into the sabbatical year, i.e., plowing in the 6th year that will benefit crops growing in the 7th year, and reaping the crops of the sabbatical year that continued growing and were actually harvested into the conclusion of the sabbatical year, i.e., reaping 7th year produce that continued to grow during the 8th year. Rabbi Yishmael, now we're on 4a, Rabbi Yishmael says this verse is to be understood as referring to Shabbos, not the Shemitah year, not the sabbatical year, the 7th year of the land when the farmers have to leave the land fallow. Rather, says Rabbi Yishmael, no, this is actually talking about Shabbos itself, the 7th day of the week, in accordance with the straightforward meaning of the verse. And it teaches like this. Just as only optional plowing is prohibited on Shabbos, as there is no instance where plowing fulfills a biblical commandment, so too only optional reaping is prohibited to the exclusion of the reaping of the Omer offering, which is a mitzvah and consequently permitted on Shabbos. What are they talking about? So on Passover, right? So when the temple is standing and Passover is being celebrated in the land of Israel, on the night following the first day of Passover, so it's actually, now we're into the 2nd day of Passover, but during that night, there's a special ceremony where they harvest some barley. It's the new barley of the new crop, right? It's springtime in Israel, and some of this early growing barley has already grown It is harvested and is going to be brought as an offering in the temple. And this is called the Omer offering, right? Bringing the Omer. And from when we bring the Omer on the second night of Passover, we're going to count those 50 days. That's going to bring us to Shavuos. And then a different offering is going to be brought on Shavuos, the 2 loaves of bread. So there's this progression from barley, which we eat, right? People eat that barley on the second night of Passover. Particularly the priests are going to eat it in the temple. And then 50 nights later, there's going to be the 2 loaves that are going to be brought, also eaten by priests. And there's this evolution from barley, which is animal food, to wheat, which is people food. And so there's always a beautiful spiritual teaching about that during the 50 days of counting the Omer from Passover to Shavuos, as we celebrated leaving Egypt and arriving at Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah, that during those 50 days is a time of spiritual refinement, right? Where we're examining all our attributes and looking to see how we can make an improvement in ourselves and become less animal-like and more human-like, worthy of making the move from barley to wheat as a sustenance for us. At any rate, for what we're talking about here, that barley, which gets harvested on the second night of Passover, it's for the purpose of a mitzvah, a biblical commandment, so that we can bring that barley offering in the temple when the temple is standing. Therefore, even if the first day of Passover was on Friday, and therefore it started Thursday night, right? The first day of Passover was Thursday night. So the second night of Passover is Friday night. Now it's Shabbos, and this has to actually be done at night. It has to be harvested at night. So can we reap? Can we harvest? Can we cut plants from the ground on Shabbos? No, we cannot. In almost every case, because that is the prohibited labor of reaping. You can't do that on Shabbos ever unless it's to reap some barley for this special offering brought in the temple. That overrides Shabbos, just like a circumcision, an 8-day circumcision overrides Shabbos. Normally drawing blood is something we would never do on Shabbos, but to do a circumcision we do. We have a bris, we would do that on Shabbos. And likewise, we're going to harvest the barley on that night, even if it falls on Shabbos. So what Rabbi Yishmael is saying is that our verse that we're studying now, in plowing and in reaping you shall rest, is actually teaching us that you shall rest unless it's a mitzvah. So too, optional reaping is prohibited, which is to the exclusion of the reaping of the Omer offering, which is a mitzvah, and consequently permitted on Shabbos. Nonetheless, the first opinion cited in the Baraisa, that of Rabbi Akiva, holds that the prohibition against plowing on the eve of the sabbatical year is derived from an explicit verse. Why was this Baraisa brought? We see a disagreement between Akiva and Yishmael about what that verse means, but at least according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, the idea that you can't plow during some period of time of the late in the 6th year before the 7th year is not a rabbinic decree, not an oral teaching given by God to Moses way back at Mount Sinai, but actually part of the written Torah. Rather, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, when we learn this as a halacha leMoshe miSinai, as a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai, it was to permit plowing in the case of young saplings until Rosh Hashanah. In contrast, the verses that were cited come to prohibit plowing in the case of mature and well-rooted trees 30 days before Rosh Hashanah of the sabbatical year. So again, we're having this kind of distinction made about what's going to be allowed toward the end of the 6th year if it's for the purpose of basically assisting the growth of produce that we're going to use during the 6th year. That's going to be permitted. But if it's for something that's only going to have a benefit for the crops in the 7th year, that's going to be prohibited, since working the land is prohibited in the 7th year. And the Gemara asks, but since the halacha leMoshe miSinai comes to permit plowing in the case of young saplings until Rosh Hashanah, the ones that we're only going to get the benefit from that in the 6th year itself, does it not automatically follow that in the case of mature trees, plowing is prohibited before Rosh Hashanah? Therefore, not only the allowance, but the prohibition as well was learned by tradition as a halakha transmitted to Moses from Mount Sinai and not from the written Torah. It was an oral teaching at Mount Sinai, not derived directly from a written verse. Rather, the law transmitted to Moses from Sinai is the basis of the prohibition against plowing on the eve of the sabbatical year, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who interprets the verse as referring to Shabbos and not to the sabbatical year. Whereas we do derive from the written verses that we can't plow on the eve of the seventh year, according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So, the Gemara previously cited Rabbi Yitzhak, who explained how Rabban Gamliel's court nullified the extension to the prohibition against plowing before the sabbatical year that had been enacted by Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. We were talking about this yesterday, that Rabban Gamliel, after the temple was destroyed, he and his court said this extension of the time that it is prohibited to plow before the seventh year, right? That into the sixth year, there's going to be a period of time. Was it 30 days? Was it as early as Shavuos? Was it even an earlier backing up all the way to Passover? We've got different opinions on that. Beis Shammai, I think, said from Passover. Beis Hillel from Shavuos. Other opinions was just 30 days. But Rabban Gamliel came and said, no, we're going to do away with that. And that was a big question yesterday. How could Rabban Gamliel's court come and nullify the decree of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, which was, put forward by a larger, wiser court earlier in time, closer to Mount Sinai? How could Rabban Gamliel and his cohort come and nullify this ruling of an earlier authority? And the way Rabbi Bach, who settled that, says, well, when they made that ruling, they realized that a later court might come to change it because that's the nature of the oral tradition. That was one explanation. Now we're going to get a different one. So the Gemara now cites another opinion, which holds that Rabban Gamliel's court abolished the prohibition against plowing before the sabbatical year entirely, not shortened it to 30 days, but just did away with it altogether. And Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabban Gamliel and his court nullified the restrictions on working the land on the eve of the sabbatical year based on a source written in the Torah. Right? So if they were making a rabbinic decree at the time of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, but then Rabban Gamliel somehow finds a source written directly in the Torah, well, maybe that's how he thought he had the authority to annul that earlier decree. How can he say that it's written in the Torah and the earlier court didn't notice it? What is the reason? Well, he derives it by means of a gezerah shava, a verbal analogy where we look at two words in two different contexts and we're going to be able to apply the law from one context to the other. So he derives it by means of a verbal analogy between the word Shabbos, stated with regard to the sabbatical year in the verse, but in the seventh year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, and the word Shabbos stated with regard to the weekly Shabbos, which commemorates the Shabbos of creation, the seventh day when God rested. So, just as there on Shabbos itself, it is prohibited to perform labor, but before and after Shabbos it is permitted, so too here in the case of the sabbatical year, during the sabbatical year itself, it is prohibited to perform labor for the sake of the land, but before and after the sabbatical year, it is permitted. So that's pretty good logic from Rabban Gamliel. But Rav Ashi strongly objects to this interpretation of why Rabban Gamliel thought he was permitted to annul that earlier decree. Says Rav Ashi, if Rabban Gamliel and his court nullified the restrictions based on a verbal analogy, then according to the one who said that the prohibition against plowing 30 days before Rosh Hashanah of the sabbatical year is a halacha leMoshe miSinai, a halacha given directly to Moses at Mount Sinai. So can a verbal analogy, which you're taking from written verses, but it's still through a procedure, derived by the rabbis, can a verbal analogy come and uproot a halacha that was transmitted directly to Moses at Mount Sinai? And similarly, according to the one who said that the prohibition against plowing during the 6th year in anticipation of the 7th year is derived from a written verse in the Torah, can a law derive from a verbal analogy, come and uproot an actual written verse in the Torah? Rather, Rav Ashi said, Rabban Gamliel and his court held in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who said that they learned this prohibition as a halacha transmitted to Moses at Sinai, but they learned this halacha only with regard to the time period when the temple is standing. This is evidenced by the fact that it is similar to the other halacha stated along with it, that of the water libation, which was taught to Moses at Sinai, that during Sukkot there would be the special ceremony of the water libation, right? That water libations would accompany the offerings during Sukkot, and then there would be a special ceremony of drawing the water from a special pool. Big celebrations, we talked about that during Sukkot, and the law that underpins the water libation during Sukkot it's not in the written Torah, but it was transmitted by God to Moses at Mount Sinai as part of that one of those core teachings of the oral tradition. But when the temple is not standing, there's no water libation. And likewise, there's no restriction on plowing late in the 6th year. New subject. We're getting back to the Mishnah. It was taught in the Mishnah. However, one may not irrigate a field on the intermediate days of a festival, right? So we're getting off finally the subject of the sabbatical year. We're back to what work is permitted to do or not permitted to do during the intermediate days of a festival. One may not irrigate a field on the intermediate days of a festival with rainwater collected in a cistern or with water drawn with a shaduf. And a shaduf is sort of like, you guys see this like in Africa and the Mideast. It's basically a well, but instead of like our mental picture of a well where there's like a cylinder where you kind of like wind the rope and it pulls the bucket up out of the well, instead you have a bucket tied to a long lever, like a long stick, like a log, a very long straight branch, heavier on one end. Think a little bit like the kind of gate that a guard might lift to allow a car through, but it's really hinged on one side with a big counterweight. So the hinge is here, and then you're like able to make this whole lever go up like that. Now put a bucket on the end, and they use that to draw water out of a well. That's what a shaduf is. Okay, so the Mishnah said that you cannot irrigate, even though you can irrigate a field during the intermediate days of a festival, just to preserve from loss, from a significant loss. Right? If it's so you get a maximum profit out of that field, no good. But if you don't irrigate all the vegetables in that field or the wheat in that field, the produce in that field is going to die. So then you are allowed to irrigate. But if irrigating requires you to draw water from a well, then it's not going to be permitted. Why? Excessive effort, right? It's going to be too much work. It's going to be too much like weekday hard labor. That won't be permitted during Chol HaMoed, during the intermediate days of the festival. Okay, so with respect to this, Rav Ashi said rainwater itself will come, I skipped the paragraph, from the shaduf. So the Gemara asks, granted, irrigating a field with water drawn with a shaduf involves excessive effort, and so it is prohibited on the intermediate days of a festival. But what excessive effort is involved in irrigating a field with rainwater? Rainwater collects on its own, and one merely has to channel it to where it is needed, right? So if there's like some kind of a pool where the rainwater collects, and to irrigate my field, all I have to do is maybe pull up like a little gate that's going to allow the water to flow into the channels and irrigate the field. That's not a lot of work. That's easy, right? That's easy. As opposed to like I have a river that flows near my farm and I open a gate and now some water channels out into my irrigation ditches and that's going to irrigate my field. That's definitely permitted to avoid loss. But if it's instead of coming from a river or a stream, instead it's coming from a pool of rainwater, for some reason that's going to be prohibited. And they're saying, granted, if I have to draw it out with buckets, okay, that's a lot of labor. But if all I got to do is pull that gate and allow water from this pool of rainwater to go into my field, why is that prohibited? That's our question. Well, that's the question. So Rabbi Ilya said that Rabbi Yochanan said a rabbinic decree was enacted with regard to rainwater due to its similarity to water drawn with a shaduf. Rav Ashi said rainwater itself will come to be like water drawn with a shaduf. Once the level of the collected rainwater drops, it will become necessary to draw it with a bucket, a procedure involving excessive effort. In other words, the difference is if I'm just going to redirect water from a stream into my field and I move the gate, boom, easy to do. But if I move that gate from a pool of rainwater, okay, well, after a while, the rainwater is going to go into my field, and then there's going to be no more water, at least not higher than the level of this little gate. And to get more water from the pool or from the well, I'm going to have to start drawing it with the bucket. And that's going to entail too much work. So the sages said no. From a stream, yes. From a well, no. Even if the water's high enough in the well that it could flow on its own without the effort of my bucket, since the level could drop, and then I would come to do it with a bucket, it's a fence around the Torah that's going to protect me from coming to do that excessive labor. In the Gemara comments, Rabbi Ilya and Rav Ashi disagree with regard to the ruling issued by Rabbi Zera. As Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Bar Yirmiyah said that Shmuel said, with regard to streams that draw water from pools of collected water, one is permitted to irrigate his field from them on the intermediate days of a festival. Oh, so which is it? Shmuel, and then the people who cite him are saying you can irrigate the field from a pool of rainwater. And Rabbi Ilya said that Rabbi Yochanan said you cannot. Well, which is it? So one sage, Rav Ashi, is of the opinion that the ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera, as he prohibits only irrigating with rainwater because the supply might come to end. But it does not prohibit watering from a source whose flow is steady, like a stream or a river. And one sage, Rabbi Yochanan, is not of the opinion that the ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera, as he prohibits irrigating with rainwater due to its similarity to water drawn with a shaduf. One is that it might come to cause labor. The other one is it's too similar to a cistern that is drawn with a shaduf. And this applies regardless of whether the level of the rainwater will drop or not. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan would prohibit using collected water, even if a stream flows through it and it will not dry up. Right? So even if your well is fed by a stream, so you can rely on the fact that its level won't drop because it resembles a well that you would normally draw water with a shaduf, he's going to say, no, it's prohibited. And the other, Rav Ashi, says, no, you can, if it's constantly fed like that, then you would be able to draw, because then we're not concerned that the level could drop. But if the level could drop, then it's prohibited. So after mentioning the statement of Rabbi Zera in the course of the previous discussion, the Gemara examines the matter itself. So Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Bar Yirmiyah said that Shmuel said, with regard to streams that draw water from pools of water, one is permitted to irrigate his field from them on the intermediate days of a festival. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raised an objection to Rabbi Zera from what is taught in the Mishna. However, one may not irrigate a field on the intermediate days of a festival with rainwater collected in cisterns or with water drawn with a shaduf. So how could Shmuel say that this is going to be permitted? This indicates that whenever there is a concern that the water might run out, it is prohibited to irrigate from this source. Consequently, Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to know why this concern did not exist in the case of the pools of water as well. And Rabbi Zera said to him, Yirmiyah, my son, these pools in Babylonia are like water that does not stop flowing. Therefore, there is no concern that the water level in these pools might go down to such an extent that it will become necessary to draw the water with buckets. It's sort of like the difference between California and Florida. Here in California, very nice weather, very nice, warm, but it's also a desert, right? So there's a collection of water and you start tapping into it, that water level might very well drop and then it won't be replenished, and then we would have to do work to continue the irrigation. Whereas in Florida, very nice weather this time of year, but lots of water all over the place. Ask any golfer. And so if you start drawing water for irrigation from a standing pool of water, you can have a great confidence that that water level won't drop in such a significant way that you'd ever have a danger that it would run out. Now, the sages taught in a baraisa with regard to temporary pools and regular pools that were filled with water on the eve of a festival, right? So before the festival started, that pool of water was full. So it is prohibited for one to irrigate his field from them on the intermediate days of the festival because they might run out of water and he will come to exert himself and bring water from elsewhere. But if a water channel passes between them so that water flows from one to the other, it is permitted, right? So this concern that the pool of water resembles water drawn with a shaduf, and therefore we can't use it to irrigate on the intermediate days, doesn't apply according to this opinion because it's fed, right? There's a spring, there's some source of running water that feeds those pools. So for sure they're not going to run out. And it's like the opinion of Rav Ashi. If you have no concern that the water will go down, you can irrigate from it. So Rav Papa said, and this allowance applies only when the majority of that field can be irrigated from that water channel, such that most of the field can be irrigated at the same time. In this case, there's no concern that when the water runs out, he will come to exert himself and irrigate the rest of the field from some other source of water. And Rav Ashi said, it applies even though the majority of the field cannot be irrigated from the water channel at the same time, since the channel continuously draws water, constantly replenishing its supply. Even if it does so at a slow rate, one will say to himself that even if the entire field cannot be irrigated from the water channel on a single day, it can be irrigated over the course of 2 or 3 days, and accordingly, there's no danger that he will come to exert himself excessively and thereby violate the character of Chol HaMoed. And this kind of answers the question that we had, I think, 2 days ago. Was it Bill who said, well, what if you can irrigate that field because, you're going to be drawing water with a pump and we have electricity now, right? So there's not, that with advanced technology, it's not going to be any kind of a situation where you're going to be hauling buckets of water to make sure that the irrigation is complete. So even though it's coming from the kind of well that normally we wouldn't want to use, given the technology, maybe we could do it. And it seems like, well, if you have reason to be confident that the water's not going to run out, at least according to Rav Ashi, that would be permitted. Now, most people aren't farmers these days, but I will share, why don't we just talk about it a little bit here quickly in passing, what are the laws that apply to us as a practical matter, right? All of this is how we derive, talking about farmers irrigating their fields on the intermediate days of a festival. So the question is, can I do my laundry on the intermediate day of the festival? Do I have to stay home from work on the intermediate day of a festival? Can I drive to a movie on the intermediate day of a festival? All right, those are the practical questions that we would have. So let's talk about what according to the halacha today, this is from Chabad.org, what are permitted activities, Chol HaMoed, anything done in order to prepare or cook food. Well, that makes sense because you could do that on a full-fledged festival day. Anything done for medical purposes. Any non-strenuous work, which, if not performed at the time, would cause loss. Right? That's what we've been talking about. If you didn't do it, it would cause a loss. It's going to be permitted as long as it is non-strenuous. And since the definition is pretty broad, the fact that technology allows us to do things that maybe in the past wouldn't have been possible without a lot of work, maybe now it's going to be permitted. Though in, borderline cases, you definitely want to check with the rabbi. Here's some additional laws. In general, business should be transacted only if it will benefit one's ability to purchase things for the purposes of the holiday, or if by not working, one's business will lose its current capital. Selling merchandise is otherwise prohibited. In other words, don't be doing deals during the intermediate days of the festival unless your failure to do the deal will cause your business a significant loss. It is forbidden to record business matters unless if by not doing so one will forget important details resulting in financial loss. This is related to the fact that no writing. You should not be writing during the intermediate days. We go shopping only for items that are needed for the holiday, unless the item is currently on sale and will be more expensive after the holiday or will be otherwise unavailable for purchase. We once went on a Passover program in Niagara Falls, and there was an outlet mall right near the hotel, which, I don't have one near me here. So I was able to buy a nice suit for an amazing price that I wouldn't have been able to do at some other time. And therefore, to avoid that loss, it was permitted to buy that suit. Doing laundry is forbidden except clothing needed for the holiday and which could not have been laundered before the festival began. Working in the field, except for essential watering and picking produce for eating during the days of the holiday, is forbidden unless refraining from the work will be financially detrimental. Weddings are not held during Hol HaMoed, though engagements are permitted. Cutting hair and shaving is prohibited. Nail cutting is permitted if one also cut one's nails the day before the festival began. Fasting is prohibited. Mourning practices are observed differently, and one should consult a qualified rabbi. And one may hire a needy person to do labors that are usually prohibited on Hol HaMoed, so as to provide him with a livelihood with which he can purchase things for the holiday, for his enjoyment of the holiday itself. So you see how these laws, eventually got worked out into what you can practically do during Hol HaMoed. So let's continue with our Gemara. Okay, the sages taught in a baraisa, with regard to a pool that receives drips of water from this field that requires irrigation, which itself receives water from a spring, one is permitted to irrigate from this pool another field situated below it that requires irrigation. Right? My field is on a hill. I've got another field further up the hill. I irrigate the uphill field, and then there's runoff from that field to the lower field. So the lower field is not receiving water from a continuous source. Technically, it's receiving water from an upper field, but since the upper field is irrigated from a continuous source, this is going to be permitted. And the Gemara asks, but isn't the pool likely to stop flowing, which will force him to exert himself and draw water from somewhere else? And Rabbi Yirmiyah said, the case is where the upper field is still trickling water into the pool and it does not stop. So Abaye said, and this allowance applies only when the water from the first spring that irrigates the upper field has not stopped flowing. Only in that case can one rely on the water trickling from the upper field and consequently irrigating the lower field from the pool. And it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says, with regard to two garden beds located one above the other, one may not draw water from the channel supplying the lower garden bed in order to irrigate the upper garden bed due to the excessive exertion. I mean, that makes sense. Water's not going to flow uphill. So if I'm going to try to use water collected in a lower garden bed to water an upper garden bed, I'm going to have to move that water up the hill. Sounds excessive. Modern times, maybe I have an electric pump to do it. Maybe it's possible. And the sages taught in a baraisa, one may draw water and irrigate vegetables in order to eat them on Hol HaMoed, on the intermediate days of the festival. But if he does this in order to improve their growth and to enhance their appearance, it is prohibited, as he is considered to be doing unnecessary work and unnecessarily exerting himself on the festival. When I read that, I was really reminded about, work that is done just to enhance the appearance of a fruit, not necessarily going to make it for the purpose of eating it and enjoying it during the festival. It's a peeve of Nina and I. It's so bad that these days, so many of the fruits and vegetables that you buy in a regular supermarket look great, no flavor, right? Like that's what America has come to, that these things sell better because they look better on the shelf. They're bigger, brighter, they seem more plump and juicy, but they've bred for that, not for sweet taste, right? And it's just so bad. These apples are just tasteless. Tomatoes that are tasteless, right? It really has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. But if you're gonna water some vegetables and fruit so that you can eat them during the festival, that's going to be permitted. But if you're going to water them so that their appearance gets better, but you're not going to eat them during the festival, or so you can have nicer fruit after the festival, that's not permitted. Gemara relates that Ravina and Rabba Tosafah were once walking along the road when they saw a certain man that was drawing water with a bucket on the intermediate days of a festival. And Rabba Tosafah said to Ravina, let the master come and excommunicate him for transgressing the words of the sages. And Ravina said to him, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa one may draw for vegetables in order to eat them? And so this man is not committed a transgression. And Rabba Tosafah said to him, do you maintain that what is meant by one may draw, madlin, is that one may draw water in order to irrigate the vegetables? That is not so. Rather, what is meant, now we're on 4b, what is meant by one may draw is that one may pull out some of the vegetables so that others may grow. You can pull some vegetables out of the ground so that the other vegetables may grow, which you're going to need, which is going to enhance their growth. But the ones you're pulling out are the ones that you're going to eat. So even though it's going to enhance the growth of the ones that remain in the ground, it's permitted since you're going to eat the ones that you pull out. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Meir disagrees, and he says his own vines he is permitted to thin out, but he's not permitted to thin out the vines set aside for the poor. And this Mishnah indicates that the term meidel can be used to mean thinning out and does not refer only to drawing water. Ravina said to Rabba Tosafah, but wasn't it explicitly taught in a Baraisa, one may draw water to irrigate vegetables in order to eat them during the intermediate days, not one may draw in order to eat the vegetables. And Rabba Tosafah said to him, well, if it is taught explicitly in a Baraisa, then the law is as it is taught, and I retract my statement. Nice little incident. New subject, it was taught in the Mishna, and one may not construct circular ditches around grapevines. And what are these circular ditches? And Rav Yehuda said they're called in Aramaic binke, and this is also taught in a Baraisa. These are uguyot bedeidin, circular ditches around the bases of olive trees and around the bases of grapevines. The question is this kind of labor, drawing these circular ditches, digging these circular ditches, or digging out already existing ditches that have become clogged, is that going to be permitted during the intermediate days? So the Mishnah said, you may not do that. And the Gemara says, well, is that so? Is it prohibited to dig circular ditches on the intermediate days? Didn't Rav Yehuda permit the family of Bartzitai to construct circular ditches for their vineyards? La kasha, this is not difficult. He permitted them to unclog existing circular ditches, but not to dig new ones. It was taught in the next clause of the Mishnah that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says one may not construct a new water channel during the intermediate days of the festival or during the sabbatical year. And the Gemara says, well, granted, it's prohibited for him to do this on the intermediate days of a festival because that's excessive labor. For sure, you can't do that. But what is the reason that it's prohibited during the sabbatical year when there's no concern about excessive labor, only that you cannot work the land? If you're digging a water ditch, are you working the land? No, that might be like a good time to do these kind of improvement projects that will benefit the land later when you send water down them, but you're not directly working the land. You're not planting, you're not harvesting. Digging those water ditches is sort of like maintenance work that maybe this is the time to do it during the 7th year. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Abba Bar Memel disagreed with regard to this issue. One of them said, it's prohibited to dig a water ditch even during the sabbatical year because it appears to others who might be watching like he's hoeing his land, that he is working the land in order to plant or to cut weeds or something like that. And the other one said it is prohibited because he thereby prepares the channel's banks for planting. When he's digging a water ditch, he's putting loose earth beside the water ditch, and that's actually like loosening that dirt, and later it's going to get planted. So both are saying it's prohibited, but one because of appearance of impropriety, and the other because you're actually preparing that soil that you loosen to be planted later. And the Gemara asked, but according to the one who said that digging a water channel is prohibited because it appears like hoeing, well, let him be concerned that the digger thereby prepares the channel's banks. The one who said it's only because of appearance of impropriety, why isn't he concerned about the fact that the dirt he pulls out of the ditch is being loosened and is going to be planted later? So rather, the matter must be explained differently, such that there is a practical difference between them in a case where he takes the earth that he excavates from the channel and he throws it a considerable distance outside. So according to the one who said it's prohibited because he thereby prepares the channel's banks for planting, there's no prohibition here as he does not prepare them for planting. It's just throwing the dirt willy-nilly. But according to the one who said it's prohibited because it appears like he's hoeing, then there is a prohibition here because this looks like hoeing. And the Gemara asks, but according to the one who said that digging the water channel is prohibited because he thereby prepares its banks for planting, why isn't he concerned that it appears like hoeing? And the Gemara answers, well, this is not a concern because it is also true that the one who hoes, that when he takes up a clump of earth, he puts it down in its place. Consequently, one who throws dug up earth far away, it is immediately apparent that he is not engaged in hoeing, but rather digging a water channel, so there's no appearance of impropriety. A Maimar would teach this Mishnah, stating explicitly that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that one may not dig a new water channel during the sabbatical year because it appears as if he were hoeing his field. And he therefore found a difficulty between this statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and another statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And what is that difficulty? Did Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah actually say that any action that causes him to appear as if he were hoeing is prohibited? One may raise a contradiction to this assertion from a Mishna, Shavi'it 3:3, that states a person may pile his manure in the field during the sabbatical year so that it becomes a storage heap, right? You live on a farm, you have animals, they produce manure. You're going to use that as fertilizer. Can you spread fertilizer on the ground during the sabbatical year? No, you cannot. You're working the land. Must you just throw the manure in the river? No, not at all. You can pile up the manure, store it during the sabbatical year, and then use it in the first year of the next cycle. Okay, where are you going to store it? Well, you're going to have a clump, some kind of a pile of that manure somewhere in a field somewhere. So when you bring that manure to your storage pile, it might look to an outsider like you're fertilizing the field. How are you going to avoid that? Well, it should be put in a place where there's an existing mound. If you add it to the mound, okay, and anybody who looks on knows that you're just transporting your manure to the manure pile, not fertilizing the field. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah prohibits piling his manure in the field unless he deepens the storage area for the manure 3 handbreadths below the surface of the ground, or he raises it 3 handbreadths above the surface of the ground, or he places it on a rock. He wants it to be very clear to the outsider who might be looking in that what you're doing is adding to the manure pile and not fertilizing the field. And Rabbi Zeir and Rabbi Abba bar Maimel both offered resolutions to this difficulty. One of them said the case in the second Mishnah where he had already deepened the 3 handbreadth pit during the 6th year, and the other one said his pile of manure is proof that he intends merely to bury the manure and not hoe the field. It was taught in the Mishnah that the rabbis say one may repair a damaged water channel during the intermediate days of a festival. What is meant by a damaged water channel? And Rabbi Abba said that if it was now a handbreadth deep because it had become filled with sediment, he may dredge it out until he sets it at the original depth of 6 handbreadth. So you can't dig a new water channel during the intermediate days. Excessive labor, right? Because it's excessive labor. But if you've got an existing water channel and it became filled with sediment to the point where it was only 1 handbreadth deep below the surface of the ground, it's totally clogged, almost to the very surface. Okay, so then you could dig out the sediment until that channel is back to 6 handbreadths deep, its proper depth. That's going to be permitted. Now, this is going to lead to a couple of questions. Okay, so it is obvious that if the channel is half a handbreadth deep and he wants to restore it to a depth of 3 handbreadths, since the water does not flow through a 3 handbreadth deep channel in sufficient quantity, it is nothing at all and it is prohibited, right? So you can dig out 5 handbreadths worth of depth of dirt to take it from 1 handbreadth deep to 6 handbreadths deep. That much labor is permitted. But what if you're going to just take it from its half a handbreadth deep and you're going to lower it down to 3 handbreadths deep? The ratio is the same, right? 6 to 1. Like we're going to go from 1 to 6. Here you're going to go from half to 3. But the idea is water won't flow through a channel that's only 3 handbreadths deep. So even though the ratio was the same, taking it from half a handbreadth deep to 3 handbreadths deep, since water won't flow through a 3 handbreadth deep channel, this is work in vain, and therefore it is prohibited. What if it's 2 handbreadths deep and you're going to take it to 7? Now it's not about ratio. Now it's that you're going to dig out 5 handbreadths depth worth of dirt, right? But you're going to take it from 2 to 7. At 6, the water will flow. So if you're going to take it down to 7 handbreadths deep, you're doing unnecessary work. You're digging out the same amount of dirt, but you didn't need to dig out as much dirt to get to 6 handbreadths deep. So taking it to 7, no, that's excessive exertion, not permitted. Okay, well, what about, or actually they're going to say taiku, right? Because you don't really need to take it down to 7, to 6 would have been enough. That should be, anything beyond that should be prohibited as excessive, or the fact that it's already been permitted in our Mishna to take it from 1 to 6, so maybe you can take it from 2 to 5, and they leave that question unresolved. I'm almost done. Final paragraph. It was related that Abaye permitted the people of Bar Hamdak to remove the branches of the trees from the river on the intermediate days of the festival. Rabbi Yirmiyah permitted the people of Sakafta to dredge out a river that had become blocked. Rav Ashi permitted his townsmen, the people of Mata Mechasya, to clean out the nearby Bernitz River. This was excessive. This was a lot of labor, right? Hard work to dredge out a river, to unblock a river, to dredge a river that had become blocked, to clean out a river, or to remove branches from a river. Why did the sages permit this heavy work? Because it benefits the public. He said, this is the last one was from Rav Ashi, and he said, since the public drinks from this river, it is considered like a public need, and we learned in the Mishna that one may tend to all other public needs on the intermediate days of the festival. There, that's what we've got today. Let's see if there's some comments or questions. Sharon, since so many farmers required loans to be able to plant for the following year, and loans are nullified in the Shemitah year, might the prohibition of planting be a way to reduce the difficulty to lenders in the 6th year? The prohibition on plowing in the 6th year, right? So because it's an extension of the prohibition to farm during the 7th year, and if you're plowing in the 6th year, late in the 6th year for the benefit of the 7th year, that's why it's going to be restricted, right? And then we were arguing about whether that's a rabbinic decree or halacha lemoshe misinai or derivable from a written verse. But what you're saying is farmers often required loans to be able to plant for the following year. Loans are nullified in the Shemitah year. You can't collect on a loan in the 7th year. We saw there was a tie between not working the land and not collecting loans. So maybe the prohibition on planting is a way to reduce the difficulty to lenders in the 6th year so that they won't extend loans that won't be repaid in the 7th year. Perhaps, but who would really suffer in that scenario? The farmers who can't get what they need, right? So maybe it's just more of a simple policy of protecting people from coming to farm the land when they're not supposed to. But it's very interesting what you're saying. It's so much of legislating any kind of law is trying to deal with the unintended consequences and the rippling effects of those policies. So nice point. Bill, does that mean, therefore, that maintaining the compost heap during the sabbatical year is an acceptable labor? You are, after all, growing something that you will then harvest, albeit not until the end of the sabbatical year. Yeah, but I think when they're saying grow and harvest, they're talking about, living things that, the actual produce that comes from the ground. Here we said the manure pile. You're talking about the compost heap, but what's the compost heap, right? It's just your scraps, right? Your scraps from the table that you're going to add onto the compost heap, and instead of throwing them into the town dump, you're putting them in a place where it's going to create fertilizer for later. It seems to me like that's going to be allowed as long as people don't think that you are fertilizing the land at the moment that you're throwing scraps onto the compost heap. Karen, when irrigating a field on intermediate festival days, the issue of concern seems to be about the infrastructure causing excessive exertion. Since it isn't possible to define the practical details of every pool, cistern, channel, and field, wouldn't it be more constructive to define what exertion is and isn't, or how to know when it's excessive? Absolutely. But I think that they're trying to share cases with us where they are defining what excessive is, right? Not, did you break a sweat while doing it, but a kind of, a kind of process that will lead to a bunch of manual work, as opposed to just pulling a gate and just letting water flow, right? And remember that there's always the two principles. One is avoid excessive exertion. The other is avoid a significant loss, but not permitted just to enhance profit. But you're right, that underlying value, or the second value, that they gave it second, I just mentioned it first, of avoiding excessive exertion. That's what's so tricky about this, right? Kind of like a weekday, kind of like a festival. And here we are on the third day of defining, what is excessive exertion. Really, at the end of the day, we keep coming back to that question. And it's not easily defined, and it's not going to be easily defined. So they're trying to give us principles so that people in other fields besides farming, or, with unusual situations that aren't covered in these cases, can somehow extend the principle, or at least their rabbi can, when they go to get a ruling. So good question. Tom, can't people who suspect someone of prohibited actions just go ask what he's doing? Yeah. Right? First of all, is it your place? And then this is a whole other field of study, right? When do we have an obligation to rebuke? Is there a difference between just the average Joe and a trained rabbi issuing the rebuke? Is there a difference between rebuking a scoffer, somebody who won't listen and we know he won't listen, versus somebody who will listen and will thank us for giving him the rebuke because it was something he might not have been aware of? Those are all factors that come into it. And maybe what they were talking about there is not, shall we excommunicate him, but rather, he's doing something that is excommunicable. Shall we go over and tell him? But first, let's make sure we're clear on the law. And then it turns out, the one who thought that guy could be excommunicated was wrong. And so it was right. It was a good idea to check with his friend, a more knowledgeable sage, before going over there and, challenging the guy and possibly embarrassing him. For we know that embarrassing someone, especially in any kind of public situation, is tantamount to murder. Obviously, that is hyperbolic, but it's just one of those values that keeps coming up in the Talmud, that you never embarrass a person if it can be avoided in any way. Okay, that's what I've got today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 5 at our regular Monday time, weekday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.